Today I wrap up my visit to the cemeteries of Texas. My first stop is in the Texas Hill Country at the Lyndon B. Johnson National Historic Site. Here on the banks of the Pedernales River, we find the Johnson Family Cemetery and the final resting place of our 36th president. Lyndon Baines Johnson was born just across the road from this cemetery on August 27, 1908. He lived here until the age of 5 when his family moved to nearby Johnson City. It was in Johnson City that a young Lyndon began a political career that would take him all the way to the White House. But first, he would serve in the United States Senate, rising to the rank of Majority Leader, where he and House Speaker Sam Rayburn, a fellow Texan, would become the most powerful men in Congress. In 1960, a fellow senator from Massachusetts named John Kennedy decided to run for president and tapped Lyndon Johnson to be his vice president. The Kennedy-Johnson ticket defeated Republican ticket of Richard Nixon and Henry Cabot Lodge. Then, on November 22, 1963, while riding in a motorcade through the streets of Dallas, President Kennedy was assassinated. A short time later, in the cabin of Air Force One, Lyndon Baines Johnson took the oath of office, becoming our 36th president. President Johnson served as president from November 22, 1963 through January 20, 1969. After leaving office, President Johnson retired to his ranch just a mile down the road from this cemetery. January 22, 1973, President Lyndon Johnson suffered a fatal heart attack and passed away at his Texas ranch. After a state funeral in Washington, President Johnson was laid to rest here under the live oaks of the family cemetery near his parents. His wife, Lady Bird Johnson, would live for another 34 years and continue to live here at the Texas ranch. Mrs. Johnson died on July 11, 2007, and is buried here next to her husband. From the Texas Hill Country, I made my way to San Antonio, where I first stopped at the Alamo. It was here in 1836, following a 13-day siege that Mexican troops under the command of General Santa Anna launched an assault on Texans who were fighting for independence and had taken refuge inside the Alamo. Almost everyone inside the mission was killed during the battle, including Davy Crockett, Jim Bowie, and William Baird Travis. After the battle, Santa Anna ordered that the bodies of the Texans be burned in several large funeral fires. That brings us to our next stop in San Antonio, the San Fernando Cathedral, which is the oldest church in Texas and is located just a few blocks from the Alamo. Sometime later, the ashes and remains of the Alamo defenders were collected and entombed here in front of the altar. The container with the remains of the defenders remained forgotten and undisturbed until 1936, when they were discovered while repairs were being made to the church. On May 11, 1938, the remains of the defenders of the Alamo were removed from their original container and placed in this marble tomb. Today, the tomb containing the remains is resting inside the alcove, just inside the entrance to the San Fernando Cathedral. From San Antonio, I traveled about 80 miles west to Uvalde, Texas, and the Uvalde Cemetery. Here, we find the grave of John Nance Gardner, who served as the 32nd Vice President of the United States under President Franklin Roosevelt. John Nance Gardner was a highly respected politician who served as the Speaker of the House of Representatives from 1931 to 1933. It was because of his popularity that President Roosevelt chose him to be his vice president, holding the office from 1933 to 1941. He eventually had a falling out with President Roosevelt and was replaced on the ticket in 1940 with Henry Wallace. John Nance Gardner retired from politics in 1941 and returned to Uvalde, where he lived the last 26 years of his life. He died on November 7, 1967, just 2 weeks shy of his 99th birthday. From Uvalde, I continued my westward trek on Highway 90 to my next stop at the Whitehead Memorial Museum in the Texas border town of Del Rio. The Whitehead Museum is a very interesting museum sitting on 2.5 acres in downtown Del Rio. It is also the final resting place of famed Western Justice of the Peace Judge Roy Bean and his son Sam. Judge Roy Bean was a frontier folk legend who was the only law west of the Pecos. He operated a saloon he called the Jersey Lily in Langtree, Texas, where he would often hold court. He was known as the hanging judge, although he only sentenced 2 men to hang and one of them escaped. Judge Roy Bean was a true frontier folk legend whose escapades have grown into the tall tales that we hear today. After a night of hard drinking, Judge Roy Bean died quietly on March 16, 1903. He was originally buried in a public cemetery, but vandals and souvenir hunters continued to vandalize his grave over the years. And several years after his death, he and his son Sam were reinterred here at the Whitehead Memorial Museum in Del Rio, Texas. It should be noted there is a small admission charge to enter the museum's exhibit area where the judge and his son are resting. It was a long drive from Del Rio to my next stop at the Concordia Cemetery in the West Texas town of El Paso. It was easy to find the grave of Old West outlaw John Wesley Hardin, as his grave is the only one in the cemetery that is protected by an iron cage. John Wesley Hardin was born on May 26, 1853 in Bottom, Texas. He killed his first person at the age of 14 when he stabbed a schoolmate. And by 1872, when he was just shy of 20 years old, he had already killed 20 men and his legend was still growing. In 1878, Hardin was captured and sentenced to 25 years in prison for killing a deputy sheriff. While in prison, he studied law, and when he was pardoned in 1894, he was admitted to the Texas bar. In 1895, Hardin opened a law practice in El Paso, where he had an affair with the wife of one of his clients. When the man found out about the affair, Hardin hired some local lawmen to kill the woman's husband. However, on August 19, 1895, one of the hired gunmen, a constable named John Selman, turned on the outlaw and shot Hardin instead. John Wesley Hardin, the outlaw turned lawyer, was 42 years old. Resting just a few yards away from John Wesley Hardin is John Selman, who was killed less than a year later when he was involved in a shootout with Marshal George Scarborough, following an argument while the two were playing cards. Selman's gravestone is inscribed, John Henry Selman, El Paso Constable and Slayer of John Wesley Hardin, August 19, 1895. From Concordia Cemetery, I made the short drive across town to the Fort Bliss National Cemetery. My first stop is at the grave of Harlem Globetrotter Reese Goose Tatum. Goose Tatum grew up in Arkansas, where he was a 3-sport star, playing basketball, football, and baseball. He played for the Negro Leagues, for the Memphis Red Sox and the Birmingham Black Barons, before Abe Saperstein signed him to play for the Harlem Globetrotters in 1942, where he became known as the Clown Prince of Basketball. Goose played for the Globetrotters until 1955, when he and Marcus Haynes left and formed their own barnstorming basketball team called the Harlem Magicians. In 1966, tragedy struck Goose when his son was killed in a car accident. Less than a year later, on January 18, 1967, Reese Goose Tatum died at his home here in El Paso, Texas. He was 45 years old. My final stop in Texas is at the grave of actor Sherman Hemsley, who played the role of Deacon Fry in the TV series Amen, but he is best known for his role as George Jefferson in the TV series All in the Family and The Jeffersons. Despite the outgoing characters that he played, Sherman was a very shy and private man. He avoided the Hollywood limelight and seldom appeared in public, and almost never gave interviews. He never married and had no children, and he lived quietly here in El Paso, where he died on July 24, 2012. He was 74 years old. Even though this video was originally for the cemeteries in Texas, I decided to add one more stop that I made a few days later in the state of New Mexico. It was in the small town of Fort Sumner, New Mexico, just a few miles off of Route 60, that I found the grave of Billy the Kid. Billy's birth name was actually Henry McCarty, and he was born in New York. But over the years, he and his mother moved west, where Henry provided for his family by doing odd jobs. In 1877, Henry killed his first man, a blacksmith by the name of Frank Cahill. He was arrested, but soon escaped and made his way to New Mexico, where he started using the name William Bonney. It was here in New Mexico that Billy became involved in the Lincoln County War, while working for John Tunstall and John Chisholm. When Tunstall was killed, Billy and several of his associates were determined to track down those responsible for Tunstall's death. As a result, he became a wanted man and was eventually captured, but again escaped while waiting trial. On July 14, 1881, Marshal Pat Garrett shot and killed the kid when he arrived at the home of his friend Lucian Maxwell here in Fort Sumter. Billy was buried here in the Old Fort Sumner Cemetery, and his grave became an instant attraction. Over the years, the grave marker has been vandalized and on one occasion stolen. Today, the graves of Billy the Kid and his pals Tom O'Fallard and Charlie Beaudry are protected by an iron cage. This concludes my visit to the cemeteries of Texas. If you like this video, give me a thumbs up below. And if you want to keep up with my travels, please subscribe. Until next time, thanks for watching.